Okay. Thank you all for coming on this rainy day. This is our midweek, what we call the Altnoy Forum. We got complaints from people who do not live in New York, who don't come here on Shabbat. They don't get to see any of the programming. So the idea was to do some programming during the week. I said, Rabbi, you should have conversations. So I said, if I'm going to have conversations, I'll only schmooze with people I actually want to talk to. And I enjoy speaking to. And I'm a pretty curious person myself. So we've interacted a lot professionally together. So it's fun to interact in a more personal way. So it's a great honor to welcome Rabbi Tzvi Romm. For many years, was the rabbi of the Bialystok Synagogue in the Lower East Side, where all the real Jews lived back in the day, and also a teacher at Yeshiva University, and most famously known as the head of the Manhattan Beth Din for conversions. So, Bruchim Abim, let's give a warm welcome to Rabbi Romm. So, let me ask you start some personal questions. Sure. How many years are you doing? Are you in the Beth Din of conversions?
So, I've been the administrator since 2010, and I started working as a judge on the conversion court 2 years before that, 2008. So really, it's 15 or 17 years, depending on how you slice it. Just before after answering the question, let me just say how much of a pleasure it is and a privilege it is to be here, to be conversing with you, to see some familiar faces out there, and to see some faces that hopefully will become more familiar as time goes on. And it's my first time being here in the shul, so that's really just spectacular. Yeah. The shul is beautiful. The system over here is a little spotty, but it's okay. Yeah. Okay. Whatever. We're good. Yes. I was the Rav in Bialystok shul for 20 years, as the rabbi mentioned, which seats 700 people. So I'm used to projecting without a microphone. But it's really just a pleasure to be here to share the conversation together with 50 of my closest friends who have come out tonight, and we're looking forward to some wonderful conversation.
Okay, how does a nice Jewish boy get involved in such a job as being on a Beth Din of conversions?
It's an interesting question. You know, life oftentimes brings us in unexpected directions. Yeah? Okay.
Jesus.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Life often brings us in unexpected directions. So I started serving as a rabbi in the Lower East Side in 2002. And getting involved in conversions was really the furthest thing from my mind. No connection to the world of people converting to Judaism. As you can imagine, being a rabbi in Manhattan, albeit a different part of Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, we had many seekers who would make their way into the synagogue and express an interest in conversion. And in all of those cases, the interest never really panned out. People would express an interest, they'd come for a little bit, and then I wouldn't really see them after that. Okay. So, it wasn't really conversion was not really something I was deeply involved in at that time. And then what happened was in 2007, the Rabbinical Council of America, of which I'm a member, the Rabbinical Council of America is the largest professional organization of Orthodox rabbis in the United States. So the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, entered into an agreement with the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. And understanding the background of that is really important for understanding just my own role and what I've gotten involved in, and really to understand something about the state of conversion in America over the last 18 years. Up until 2007 in New York, conversion was carried out in the Orthodox community on an entirely private basis. Let's say somebody in 2003 was interested in converting and becoming an Orthodox Jew. So there were no shingles out. We do conversions. You sort of had to rely on word of mouth and, make your way to that secret group of Orthodox rabbis in the New York area who were known to be involved in conversions. There was no institution that was involved in an organized way. You found one of these rabbis. Some of them were very good in terms of setting up curriculum, in terms of having an organized program, and in terms of having standards of knowledge and commitment which they insisted upon. And those conversions were always looked to and recognized really on a very, very wide scale. There were other individuals who would perform conversions where they did not demand much in terms of commitment or knowledge. Sometimes, they would demand quite a bit in terms of remuneration, which was a sort of ugly underbelly of the conversion world. And everything was sort of hit and miss because there was no organization which was overseeing everything. And in 2007, the Rabbinical Council of America decided, in conjunction with the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, that they would set up a system of nationwide Batei Din, courts for conversion. They would have a universal set of standards. Everything that would be performed by those conversion Batei Din would be recognized by the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. And this would be a new system to try to streamline and systematize the whole process of Orthodox conversion in the United States.
Can I stop you there?
Sure.
What are the universal standards of conversion?
Okay, so the 20-second answer which I give to that question, to convert with an Orthodox Beit Din means becoming an Orthodox Jew. That's the simplest answer to the question. Now, that means committing to a life of Shabbat, kashrut, involvement in the Orthodox Jewish community, prayer, blessings, really taking on the life of an Orthodox Jew in its fullness, and acquiring enough knowledge to be able to be credible as an Orthodox Jew. Now, we don't insist...
1 second. What defines an Orthodox Jew?
How long did you say this conversation is supposed to go on for?
The earliest morning service tomorrow is 7 a.m., so we got almost 12 hours to go.
Okay, yeah, that it might take us that long. In a functional Orthodox synagogue, everybody is welcome regardless of their level of observance, and I think that's what an Orthodox synagogue should be
so
about.
We would hope to aspire to.
Right. But a good Orthodox synagogue, the doors are wide open to anyone who wants to come. But what Orthodox Jewry ultimately is about, Orthodox Judaism is ultimately about, is a commitment to the laws of the Torah and a good faith effort to try to follow those laws to the best of one's ability. We all fall short, but the question is, are we falling short because we're trying and falling short, or we're falling short because we're not really trying? So the hope, to really be somebody who's committed to a life of Torah mitzvot is, I'm keeping Shabbat, I'm keeping kosher, I'm davening, I'm giving tzedakah, I'm giving charity. These are all things that are part and parcel of the Orthodox life, and things that we're gradually bringing someone into a world of performing those mitzvot, when they come into the Orthodox world.
So if we could stop you there.
Yeah.
We have 613 commandments. How many of those is the person supposed to be keeping? When you say Shabbat, how do you define someone keeping Shabbat? When you say kosher, how do you define someone keeping kosher? There are different levels of observances. How do you create a universal level of standard of conversion when within communities, within families, there are different variances and levels of observance?
So it's an excellent question. One of the hallmarks of our system, and I think it's a hallmark of Orthodox Judaism as a whole, is that we believe strongly that every Jew needs a rabbi. Every Jew needs a rabbi. The truth is, as you and I both know, even rabbis need rabbis, right? Because they're people that we go to, because as erudite as we are, there's always some question which you have to bump up the chain, the ladder. But, a Jew needs a rabbi. A born new Jew needs a rabbi, and a convert needs a rabbi. Everybody needs a rabbi. If your rabbi can tell you that Jewish law says you should be doing X, so that's legitimate. Now, different rabbis out there will tell you different things about Jewish law. How do you make a cup of tea on Shabbat? Do you need to use tea essence? Do you need to pour it into a third vessel? Can you pour it into a second vessel? Depends which rabbi you ask. Can you take a Shabbat elevator? Can you not take a Shabbat elevator? It depends which rabbi you ask. They're legitimate opinions. We recognize different legitimate opinions. But there isn't any Orthodox rabbi who's going to tell you, feel free to cook on Shabbat, it's fine. So, as long as you can identify honestly with an Orthodox rabbi who tells you this is a valid interpretation of Orthodox Jewish law, of what the Torah is telling us to do, we can define that as part of the great umbrella of Torah mitzvot.
Can I be annoying?
You mean more annoying?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll make it more practical.
Okay.
Someone wants to, what does it mean to keep Shabbat? Very simply. Does that mean a person, and how do you verify that? Someone tells you, walks in, I'm keeping Shabbat. You don't have spies, you don't track their cell phones to see if they turn them off. How do you know that? So I'll ask you two questions. First of all, how do you know when someone keeps Shabbat? And for me, very often, even when you vouch for someone, it's difficult. I've so many times in my mind was inspired and committed to losing weight. And I promised I would never again be seduced by a piece of chocolate cake. I would never again go down a rabbit hole of attacking a pint of ice cream late at night. And I was confident at that moment that I would never do it. With time, I'm disillusioned with my resolutions that I've made throughout the years.
I can't relate to that at all.
So question number one, how do you know when someone's saying that they're sincere? Question number two, how do you know, even if they're sincere, if this is something that's going to last?
Right. Oh, it's an excellent question. Look, in the end of the day, there's a huge amount of trust that is built into the system, which is why, from our perspective, one of the biggest sins you can do in a conversion process is to lie to the conversion court. Like if we catch you in a lie, that's one of the worst things you can possibly do.
Because the whole thing is based on trust.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's not exclusively based on trust. Every candidate we work with has, as we mentioned before, a rabbi who interacts with that candidate regularly. Often, the rabbi can pick, again, the rabbi is also not a spy, but rabbis typically do have a sense, maybe it's the sixth sense that God gives rabbis. Rabbis do have a sense of their congregants and what they're doing and what they're not doing. It's not perfect, but the rabbi does develop a sense.
How can a rabbi know? You don't go into their homes. You don't follow them. You don't follow when they're on a business trip in Japan where they're going out for dinner. I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of like...
Right, you didn't take that course in rabbinical school where they tell you about how to...
Actually, when I was in the KGB, that was part of the...
Right, okay, yeah.
In Moscow when I grew up.
Right. So look, in the end of the day, like I said, it comes down to a certain amount of trust, but one of the things that's very, very important is time on task. It's... time on task, meaning... You can fool people for a certain period of time. It's hard to fool people for an extended period of time. Again, we're not walking in with the assumption that anyone is trying to fool us or the like. We work with the assumption that people who are coming to us are honest, and I think generally speaking they are. And we assume the best of people. But at the same time, just, in any system, you always have to have safeguards to safeguard against someone who is not being honest.
What would you say is an appropriate amount of time that a conversion process should?
So we typically have the person go through the process for somewhere between a year and 2. Meaning the assumption is that, among other things, it takes a year or 2 just to acclimate oneself to an Orthodox lifestyle.
To get a degree in gender studies, it's 4 years in the United States. To become, okay.
Okay. Maybe there's a lot more to learn about in gender studies. I don't know. But we feel that between a year and 2, one can get a good sense of what it means to be an Orthodox Jew. And also we can get a good sense between ourselves and the local rabbi of who the person is. Is this a person who comes across as a sincere person? Is this a person who comes across as a dedicated person? Right. In the end of the day, there's a certain amount of trust that is built into the system, as it should be. Again, I think on a fundamental level, it's appropriate to trust people. We shouldn't go in with the assumption that people
So again, a very basic thing, what is expected of a person at a time of conversion?
Right, so we want to see somebody who's keeping Shabbat fully, who's keeping kosher fully, who's davening appropriately, if they're a man, davening 3 times a day, making brachot before and after foods and other occasions, and integrated fully into a community. A major part of Orthodox life is community, not just living on the proverbial island, but really being part of a local shul. And as I think many people here can probably attest to, when you are part of a community, when you're part of a shul, people get to know you. If you haven't figured this out yet, right, the Orthodox world is a fishbowl. There's some big fish bowls, there's some small fish bowls, but one way or the other, it's a fishbowl. And when you ask, how do people really know who you are? Somehow the nature of our tight-knit community is people do get to know you very, very quickly if you're integrated into the community.
I'll ask you some questions. How many conversions does the Bet Din do a year?
So we do about 100 a year. We cover, again, just going back to what I was speaking about in the beginning, the system of conversion courts that was set up in 2007 is regional. So just the other day, somebody emailed me from Dallas and asked, if they could come to us for conversion. So as a good New Yorker, my first question was, where's Dallas? I mean, I'm from the Lower East Side, so I know where Houston is, but where's Dallas? It's next to Houston. It's near Houston. Same state. Okay. Yeah. So, but I said, okay, we have a branch in Dallas. Yeah, you should turn to the people in Dallas. We cover New York State and Connecticut, right? If you're on the other side of the Hudson River, we refer to you to our Jersey branch. So we're regional in nature, but in that region, in the New York State.
Very snobby. Okay.
Yeah. Well, we include Connecticut.
Okay.
It's nice. We let them in. So within that region, New York State and Connecticut, we do about 100 a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of how many men and how many women are of those 100?
It's very lopsided. Anyone want to take a guess what the percentages are? We'll have audience participation over here.
70-30 women.
Yeah, that's about right. Right. It's about 70-30, 75-25. About 3/4 of the people converting are women, or about a quarter are men. Do you want to hear my explanation as to that? Yeah? Okay. I really believe that women are innately more spiritual. And that accounts for the fact that you have such a lopsided spread, of people.
Is that also for marriage, the converting for?
Yeah, so we'll talk about converting for marriage. Another myth which I'll dispel, I personally thought before getting involved in this, probably 95% of the people converting for marriage, right? There's like 3 people out there probably just converting for altruistic reasons, but who does stuff for altruistic reasons, I mean, it's a lot lower than that. I would say somewhere between 30 and 40% is quote unquote for marriage. And even out of that 30 to 40%, a good percentage of that are people who grew up Jewish. We'll talk about this a little bit later. People who grew up Jewish, always thought of themselves as Jewish, and for whatever reason are not actually Jewish according to Jewish law. And I joke that a good part of what we are involved in is converting people from Judaism to Judaism.
Jewish law or Orthodox?
One second, we'll get to questions
okay.
in a second. Great question.
Yeah.
What's the percentage of the converts whose father is Jewish, who are not Jewish on the matrilineal side?
I don't know an exact number, but it's a significant percentage. I would say, off the top of my head, without really looking at the numbers, it's probably around 30% or something like that.
How is a conversion of someone who grew up identifying Jewish, but not being halachically Jewish, differ than a conversion of someone who has no Jewish background?
Right. So let me first talk about how it's the same. So in the end of the day, what we expect from the person is the same expectations. Meaning, we want to see the person taking on a fully Orthodox lifestyle. So that part is the same. Where it may differ is in the following sense. So first of all, we are much more encouraging, theoretically, of somebody converting when they grew up with a Jewish identity, albeit not a halachic Jewish identity. Just as a matter of principle, as people probably know, we're not a proselytizing religion. We're not out there on the street handing out pamphlets.
Why not?
Why not? Because it's hard to be a really committed Orthodox Jew, and we don't want to just willy-nilly ask people to do that unless they really fully understand and appreciate what they're getting involved in. In the case of somebody who grew up with a Jewish identity, however, we are more encouraging of that. Again, assuming that you're going to take on a lifestyle of commitment to Torah mitzvot. In some cases, somebody who grew up Jewish will have a faster process simply because they know a lot already. Right? So let me give you one example. We're supposed to have stories tonight, so we'll have stories with the names changed to protect the innocent. But one of the memorable stories that I remember was a woman who was about a month away from her wedding. She had been raised in a Beis Yaakov environment. She went to the Beis Yaakov Orthodox system of schools throughout her entire life. And now in her early 20s, she was actually teaching in a Beis Yaakov. She was engaged to be married in about a month from the time that she came to us. And lo and behold, after some new information about her maternal grandmother surfaced, it emerged that she was, in all likelihood, not Jewish at all. Apparently, her mother's mother, unbeknownst to anyone in the family up until that point, had actually been raised in an orphanage, adopted by a Jewish family, never converted, and the family at some point adopted an Orthodox lifestyle, but again, there was no conversion that took place on the maternal line. So this young lady was raised in a very fervently Orthodox environment, knew nothing else in her life other than Judaism, but in point of fact was actually not Jewish according to Jewish law. So that, that was a little bit of a problem. From the time that she met with us till the time that she converted was about a week, because basically what we were going to ask from her, do you know what it means to be an Orthodox Jew? Yeah, I've been doing it my whole life. Are you committed to being an Orthodox Jew? Yeah. I'm actually teaching Orthodox Judaism in a Beis Yaakov school. So yeah, things like, cases like that, which we have, go very, very quickly. So in some ways it can be a very expedited process. Sometimes, though, it can be a little bit more difficult to convert, quote unquote, from Judaism to Judaism, because sometimes it's a process of unlearning what you thought Judaism was. right? So in other words, we're not only asking for the person to commit to Judaism in the general sense, we want somebody to commit to Orthodox Judaism. So if your notion of what Judaism is different than that, there may be a certain process of letting go of certain elements of what you considered to be Judaism in order to enter into the Orthodox world. And sometimes, in some ways, that could be even harder than somebody who's coming from a totally non-Jewish environment.
You know, in yeshiva, there was always a question. I remember it was one night, it was like 2 a.m. in the morning. Probably were a few open beers in the room. I can't exactly remember. And someone asked a question, what happens if you find out that you're switched to birth and you're not Jewish? Would you convert to Judaism? So, 2 a.m. in the yeshiva dorm. There's nothing else to do. So, one of my friends says, if I find out I'm not Jewish, according to Jewish law, I don't have to be Jewish? You're crazy? I think the next plane to New York, I'm out of here, I'm done. Second guy says, second one said, what I would probably do, I'll go chill for a year, do whatever I want.
Amish. The Amish.
Exactly, like the
go.
Amish.
Right.
Go out, have my time, and come back and convert, because at the end of the day, I believe if God gave the Torah at Sinai, that we're waiting on the holiday of Shavuot, and I believe that the world has a creator, and I believe in what I've been told my whole life, eventually I'll convert, but if I have a pass, I have a pass. They turned to me, and I said, of course I was already diplomatic planning my sermons, I said, I would like to think I would convert right away, but I can't really speak until it actually happens. And the fourth friend in the room said, what do you mean? I say every single day in Aleinu L'Shabech, Shlo sam chalkeinu k'hem v'go'aleinu k'chol emunam, v'anachnu kor'im u'mishtachavim u'modim lifnei melech melchei hamlechim. The prayer of Aleinu is, thank you. I give gratitude to Hashem that I'm serving you. If I wouldn't convert right away, I'm not true to what I'm actually saying every single day. That I'm proud to be part of this assembled team, assembled nation. And the reason we're having this conversation today is because in a few days we're having the holiday of Shavuot, where the Jewish people all stood at Sinai and converted. We're going to read the book of Ruth, a great Jewish woman. And by the way, I didn't welcome your wife is here, very honored. I just, to a rabbi's wife to come to another event in another shul, it's not to be taken for granted, so we're very honored to have you here. Shira Romm, Shakach. But Ruth said the famous words when it came to conversion. Ba'asher telchi elech, ba'asher talini alin. Wherever you go, I go. It's the only daughter-in-law who loved her mother-in-law unconditionally. It's the first time, it's the last time, never happen again. Where you go, I go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Amech ami, ve'elokai elokai. Your nation is my nation, my God is my God. So, do you put the emphasis on being part of the Jewish nation, or on believing in God? Some people are very Jewish, very nationalistic, very involved on every single plane to Israel. Other people are talking to God. Where do you put the emphasis?
Yes. You need both. That's really what it is. And, Ruth encapsulates that in 4 words. Amech ami ve'elokai elokai. Your nation is my nation. Your God is my God. Interestingly enough, in that order, a healthy commitment to being a Torah-committed Jew means to be part of the Jewish people. I have an article which I think is floating around online. You can take a look. The truth is, I would tell you to take a look later, but today's day and age, you can take a look right now. If it gets boring, you can just pull up the article about the role of anti-Semitism in conversion, especially post-October 7th, and the notion that so many of our converts felt. I think all of us were affected. All of us were affected. Not I think. We all were affected by the events of October 7th. I would imagine that almost all of us sitting in this room, together with the sense of horror after October 7th, also felt a sense of even greater closeness to the rest of the Jewish people after the events of October 7th. You know, those events caused us to feel even more connected to our Judaism. And I think for many converts, again, just hearing from many converts after October 7th, that feeling of connectedness is even more acute. You know, here, I didn't really have to be a part of this. I joined this people. And now I really feel like I'm a part of the fabric of the Jewish people in good times and in bad times. Amech ami. You know, your nation is my nation. And that's why we put such a big emphasis on community. You know, you can't just sit in a library all day and read Jewish books. You know, it's about connecting to a community in the fullest sense of the term. But on the other hand, it's not just about the community, it's about that connection to God, which is so basic and important, you know, to who we are as Jews. You mentioned Aleinu l'shabeach, so I'll give you another story. This is a great story. And it's, you know, it's something that I think is just very poignant for all of us. So we had a guy who told us the following story. So he was a biker, a motorcycle biker.
Like a Harley Davidson, like the real thing?
I guess so. I mean, his name wasn't Harley, but you know, it's we could work on that. You know, Chaim Davidson. I don't know, maybe. So anyway, he was a biker. He got into an accident. Thank God he survived the accident, but he was laid up for a while. And he had been toying for some time with an interest in Judaism. You know, bought some books. He was reading. You know, yeah, no, he was kind of interested. And then after the accident, he was laid up in bed for months. So, you know, he didn't have a lot to do, so he was reading. He had bought a Hebrew-English Siddur prior to his accident, you know, as part of his interest in Judaism. He bought a prayer book, and he had it at his nightstand, you know, next to the bed where he was convalescing. So he opened it kind of randomly one day as he's lying in bed, you know, staring at the ceiling. And he happened to open to the prayer of Aleinu. And he read it. You know, God didn't make us like the nations of the world. We have this special relationship. We bow down to the Almighty. And he said, wow, this is amazing. I'm inspired. When I get out of this situation of convalescing, I'm going to make that push. I'm going to go through and become Jewish. And that's exactly what happened. He recovered. He contacted the Bet Din, and he started his process in earnest. So I have to say, when he told us that story, I was totally blown away by that, because I don't know about you. I was in a shul recently where they had a sign on the wall, just remember, Aleinu is not tfilat haderech, the prayer that you say when you're embarking on a journey. For so many people, when they're saying Aleinu, they start in their seat, and by the time they're halfway through Aleinu, they're out the door already. You know, Aleinu is one of the most neglected prayers in the prayer book. But that prayer made this guy decide to become Jewish. Right? He became Jewish by the virtue of reading Aleinu. So how many things are we missing out on that if we took seriously, we would really be moved by them if we just opened up our eyes and read what we were actually saying?
I want to ask you, do you adjust the conversion expectation depending on a person's intellect? So for example, some people are very good with languages.
Yeah.
So for them, learning Hebrew is easier. Some people learning another language is almost impossible.
Right.
Some people don't have a great memory. So for them to memorize blessings and the blessings before food, after food, for some people learning the laws of Shabbat is easy. For others, you know, they never went to college, or they're not, you know, they have a trade, but they're not you know, scholastically oriented. How do you adjust the conversion depending on the skills of the person?
Right, we definitely do. Having said that, I will say that I think the basic things we ask for are within the grasp of pretty much anyone. You know, again, we're not asking for scholarship. We're not making people into rabbis or the like. We want people to know the sort of thing that you need to do in order to be a functional, observant Jew. So again, even if you don't know the minutia and the details, we push for that because in general, the more rooted you are in the details and the minutia, the more you're connected, to the Torah itself. But in the end of the day, we're not going to turn somebody away because they're trying their hardest and just, languages are not their thing, memorization is not their thing or the like. I remember we had, I think the oldest person we ever converted was an elderly Russian woman who was married to a Russian man. They were both in their 80s. They'd both come from I would say they'd come from the former Soviet Union, but when they came, it was the Soviet Union, not the former Soviet Union. They had both come from the Soviet Union. Basically, he had grown up Jewish in the Soviet Union. He had refrained from getting married for a long time because he couldn't find a Jewish girl to marry. And finally, he couldn't do it anymore. He got married at somewhat of an older age to a woman who agreed to act as if she was Jewish and observant. They kept Shabbat and kosher in the Soviet Union to the best of their ability. And then when they were able to, they emigrated to the United States. They settled in Bensonhurst. We're all, it was either there or Brighton Beach. Those were the two choices. And this was a guy who came to shul every morning. He looked like the quintessential Russian Jew. Had one of those little caps. Came to shul in the morning. Had a l'chaim after davening. So one fine day, he walks up to the rabbi of the shul and says, Rebbe, can you help me with, I have an issue. He says, what's your issue? He says, I need to convert my wife. So the rabbi picked himself off up the floor, and they met with us. She was an incredibly intelligent woman. Her English was very broken. Neither of them really spoke English. He spoke Yiddish. She spoke kind of a broken English. She was able to learn the brachot, but to read Hebrew, a woman in her 80s, it was incredibly difficult. Okay, but, so we did.
She was committed.
She was committed. There was no question she was committed. It was the one time that when we asked the questions, when the person converts in the mikveh itself, we ask a series of questions about their commitment to Judaism. So we said, we want you to do this in your original language. Answer da to all the questions.
You could have called me up. I would have helped out.
Had I known, I would have been in touch.
He asked, are you planning on being a Jewish in 40 years from now? That's a question. Conversion for the sake of marriage. It used to be unacceptable. Now it is. What happened, and what's your take on it?
So the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Talmud, says that you're not supposed to convert somebody if their intent in converting is to marry a Jewish person. The Shulchan Aruch says if, for whatever reason, the Bet Din went ahead and did the conversion, after the fact, it's binding. Okay, so after the fact, it's binding, but we're coming before the fact, ab initio, right? So how do we have the right to do that? So already the commentaries on the Talmud say that if you can discern that although the person's initial motivation might have been for the sake of marriage, in the end of the day, you see that they are firmly and sincerely attached to Judaism, you're allowed to go ahead with it and do the conversion. We always ask the person who's converting, when they're converting with a significant other, if this person wasn't in the picture, would you still want to go ahead with the conversion? I've never yet had the person who said, oh no, I would never do that. I guess, they're smart enough to say that. Now, if I was sitting in your place right now, I would say, okay, come on, but what do you expect them to say? Is that really sincere? Clearly they're doing it for the sake of marriage. If I was in your place, that's exactly what I would say as well. But having been in this for 15 years, I've seen time and time again how people who started in a process because of a significant other end up being firmly committed in their own right. And not only that, bringing the significant other, who oftentimes was kind of wishy-washy in their Jewish commitments, bringing the significant other to a point where they're embracing a full life of Torah mitzvot, which they didn't have otherwise. Another story?
No, I want to ask you.
Oh, no, okay.
I want to hear stories, but I want to ask
Okay.
2 more questions.
Okay.
And I'll just say comments I hear from
The world. People out
members
there.
all the time.
Okay.
Comment number 1.
Yeah.
Also, comment number 1, that when you allow conversions that are particularly for the sake of marriage, you're condoning young Jewish men and women to date outside of the faith. What's your response to that? And particularly at a few fathers, different people came to me and said, listen, most of the people who convert are women, and my daughters are not going to get married because if we just convert all the Jewish boys who go to college and come back with a non-Jewish girlfriend and she gets converted, what's going to be with our Jewish daughters? These are comments I
Right.
received not once, not twice,
Right.
not 3 times. How would you respond?
So first of all, I've gotten the same comments, probably even more than you've gotten them, because it's just in what I'm involved in. There's legitimacy to those points, but I think they're legitimate responses as well. So number 1, aren't you encouraging, let's not even say condoning, aren't you encouraging interdating if people know that there's a solution? You know, if they're dating somebody who's non-Jewish, all they need to do is go to the Bet Din, and under the right circumstances, the non-Jewish dating partner will be converted. That's true, but let's fill in the words, all they need to do. All they need to do is go with that person they're dating to a Bet Din, undergo a process that will last a year or 2 in the good situation, which involves a total transformation of his life and her life, where they basically turn their religious lives, their social lives, everything about their lives upside down. All they need to do is that simple process, and then there'll be a simple solution to the fact that they were interdating. Okay, that doesn't sound like a simple solution to me. We're not, yes, there is a way out, there is a way of fixing this issue, but it's not a quick fix. And certainly anyone who thinks through that and says, well, you know, no big deal, I'll just interdate and it will be easy to have my, you know, the person that I'm dating convert to Judaism. It's possible, but it's certainly not a quick and, you know, simple process.
So to the contrary, how many people does the Bet Din reject a year?
We reject very few people, I'll tell you the truth. Mostly because the people who approach us know what we stand for, know what our standards are, and, you know, are prepared.
It's a self-selecting,
Right.
it's a grueling process.
Right. I can't tell you how many people don't come to us by definition, but
How many people start the program but never finish?
a very small percentage, probably less than 5%. We have about 130 applicants a year. In any given year, like I said, we convert about 100. And again, I don't know that means that only 100 out of the 130 convert, because again, it's a process that usually takes 1 to 2 years and sometimes more than that. Sometimes people drop out on their own. The only real reason that
Do people sometimes say this is too much, this is not for me?
Yeah, no, we definitely have had that. We definitely have had that. But again, I think most people who start end up finishing the process at some point.
And when people come to me about conversion, I tell them a line. I said, conversion is easy. Recognition is very difficult.
That is true.
Could you speak about that?
Yeah, so like I indicated at the outset, part of what made our system of conversion courts powerful is the fact that we entered into an agreement with the Israeli Chief Rabbinate in 2007. Everything we do is recognized by the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. I guess in theory it doesn't have to be this way, but the recognition of the Israeli Chief Rabbinate is generally seen as the yardstick by which, the general recognition of a conversion is recognized. There are definitely people out there who will do quickie conversions without demanding much in terms of knowledge, without demanding much in terms of commitment, without even demanding much in terms of interaction. I mean, I've heard stories of somebody calling certain rabbis, to go through a conversion process. And the first and last time they actually met the rabbi in person was at the mikveh. Just show up at the mikveh at such and such a time. We'll do the conversion. We'll give you your papers, and that's the end of the story. There definitely are stories out there like that. There was a survey done of the converts who were converted through the RCA's conversion system that was done about 10 years ago. And, the converts were asked, what's the most important thing to you in terms of a conversion process? And the answer was the sense that we're going to be recognized. The idea of going through a conversion process and then you find out that there are even some portions of the Orthodox world that don't consider that conversion process valid in some way is an incredibly devastating feeling. I mean, imagine, in an academic context, you put in 4 years of your life to get a degree from a university, and then they hand you something which nobody else, none of the graduate schools seem to accept. It's a devastating feeling. That's in an academic context. Now let's imagine that it's not just an academic context, it's your whole life, it's your whole personality, it's your whole persona which is being challenged. A very, very devastating set of affairs.
So let me ask you a question. One of the big commandments of Judaism is ve'ahavta mitager, to love the convert. How is the Orthodox community doing in the observance of that mitzvah?
Right. So first of all,
How would you rank? How would
we rank? How are we doing? Right. To quote Ed Koch. Right.
How am I doing today?
The bridge is not far from here. Right. How are we doing? So first of all, I think an important point to make is that the very creation of a system that affords a universal recognition of the convert is one of the biggest ways we can fulfill the commandment of loving the convert. Meaning, what does the convert want more than anything else?
The mitzvah of loving the convert is after they're converted, or when someone says they want to be converted?
So that's actually a debate among the medieval authorities. There are those, it's clearly after they convert. There are those who say that helping a convert who's sincere convert is itself a fulfillment of the mitzvah to love the convert. It's a very interesting idea. But I think affording that kind of universal recognition is one of the biggest presents that we can give the convert. What does the convert in their role as a convert want more than anything else? They want to be integrated into the Orthodox community. They don't want anyone questioning them. They don't want anyone questioning their kids. And all of those are legitimate, reasonable expectations. So by affording them a conversion which will have that kind of universal recognition is something that is very important. How are we doing as a community? I think we're doing a lot better than we were years ago for a very simple reason. I think the Orthodox community is now cognizant of the fact that there are converts among us. I think growing up, I kind of thought converts were like this very exotic group of people. I read stories about converts. There was a convert who was a contemporary of the Vilna Gaon in the 1700s.
Tatsky.
Right. His yahrzeit is coming up on the second day of Shavuot. Things did not work out particularly well for him. He was burned at the stake in Vilna in the early 1700s on the second day of Shavuot.
Vilna.
Yeah, right.
Speaking of
that part worked out okay, but it was the burning part before the burial that he probably didn't work out so well for him. So those are the stories. Wow, these incredible stories, historical stories of converts. Wow, okay, but people don't really do that nowadays. That's like ancient history. And lo and behold, no, that's not true. Actually, every single Orthodox synagogue you go to today is likely, probably even extremely likely, to have at least some converts who are part of the congregation. And I think the Orthodox community, which maybe previously, going back a couple of decades, wasn't quite ready to accept that reality, now recognizes that reality. And I think there's a greater sensitivity to converts. But there are things we can do to be even more sensitive. I'll give you an example, a simple thing. We have this game we play in the Jewish world, we call it Jewish geography. Right? So you're sitting around the Shabbos table, and there's some people there who, have been invited over. Some of them are friends, some of them are friends of friends, some of them you don't really know, whatever. Okay, but we're going around we're going around the table, and you remember camp? Yeah, Camp La Vie. That was something else. Whoa, okay, Camp La Vie. John, where did you go to camp? Oh, you probably never heard of it. Yeah, it was affiliated with my high school. Oh yeah, which high school? No, you never heard of it. No, really, which high school was it? Well, it was this place, like Forest Hills. Oh, Forest Hills, yes. Chofetz Chaim, maybe. St. Mary's. I don't remember the Rosh Hashiva there. So again, some people are very, very comfortable about talking about their experiences, and their life is an open book, and that's fine. But there are a lot of people who are private, and their idea of sharing their life story is not necessarily in the presence of 25 people that they randomly met at a Shabbos table over cholent. So I think we have to be very, very sensitive to that. The Jewish geography thing is nice, and it's a nice way to connect and make friends and all that. But,
I never liked it,
Yeah, but not everybody wants to be outed at a Shabbos table to talk about their life. If they want to, that's great. But, there has to be a certain sensitivity to that. And I think the biggest sensitivity, which I think as a community we really have to think about long and hard, is helping people who join the Jewish community from outside marry if that's something that they're planning on doing. Again, there are some people who convert and they have a potential marriage partner already lined up. Okay, great. If that works out, that's great. A lot of people come into the Orthodox community and, now they want to get married. So that's wonderful. So they don't have the same kind of network necessarily that people who were born Jewish or born Orthodox have. And one of the biggest things we can help them out with is in that area of life. And that's not always a simple thing.
Do you follow up with converts? Is there a follow-up program to see how they're doing after they converted?
We do. We try to follow up a year, and then beyond that as well.
You collect data?
Thank God. We're working on having a more systematic collection of data. That's one of the things I'm working on doing in the Bet Din.
Has it ever happened that you retracted a conversion?
So there's no such thing in Jewish law of retracting a conversion. The only thing that can happen is that it becomes clear within a short period of time that the person was not sincere at the moment at which they converted. So in other words, if a person converts and then even 6 months down the line decides, this is it, I don't want this anymore, I want to become a Christian, let's say, for argument's sake, Jewishly, they cannot withdraw the conversion. Jewishly, we, the Bet Din, cannot withdraw the conversion. Once you convert honestly and sincerely to Orthodox Judaism, you are a Jew for the rest of your life. No backsies, as we used to say once upon a time. Having said that, if it becomes clear within a short period of time after the conversion that the whole thing was a fake, in other words, the person converts and 2 days later they're acting in a way which is totally against the commitments that they made, or they failed to disclose some crucial piece of information, so then it's not so much a retraction of the conversion, it's a sign that the conversion was never really valid to begin with.
That happened.
I had 3 such cases out of probably the 1,500 cases that we've had. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Quick answers. What's unique about Ger Katan when there's a child who's being converted? How is that conversion different?
Right. So an essential part of conversion is committing to a life of Torah mitzvot. Even though every parent thinks their kid is precocious and is a baby Mozart in the making, a 6-month-old baby who has been adopted by a Jewish family and is being converted as a child is somewhat not quite able to express their readiness to commit to a life of Torah mitzvah for the rest of their life. So while a child can be converted, they're also given the choice at the age of bar bat mitzvah as to whether they want to continue with this or not. Somebody was just speaking to me today. We converted a young boy together with his mother about 6-7 years ago. His bar mitzvah is coming up this summer, and he will have the choice. I mean, the choice that you were talking about in the yeshiva dorm at 2 o'clock in the morning, he probably won't be talking about it at 2 o'clock in the morning. I really hope that there are no open bottles of beer when he's discussing this issue. But he'll have the opportunity, if he so desires, to say, I don't want to continue, right? So that's a very important point about a child converting, which is different than an adult converting.
Just to end, we'll turn it for questions, but coming back to the holiday of Shavuot, the message is with the book of Ruth, essentially, there's a magazine, actually, as a member of the community called Lifestyles Magazine. At the end of Lifestyles Magazine, he had, it's philanthropists, and he ranks their philanthropy, and he has 3 categories of wealth. One is inherited, one is self-made, and one is, so basically they're people who just inherited wealth, people who made it themselves. And then there's a third category, inherited and growing. People who've received but also are growing on their own. Essentially, every Jewish person, even if you're born Jewish, there's a moment you have to choose. You can't just be Jewish because your parents taught you. There's a point where you leave home and you have to make decisions for yourself. For some people it's in college, for some people it could be later on in life. That you're not doing it for your parents, you're doing it for yourself. So essentially, we're supposed to ask ourselves, are we ready to choose it? We're ready to stand at the footstep of sign and say, I will go, I'll follow the way as well. So, Rabbi Romm, first of all, I want to thank you for coming to speak to us about the subject. Second of all, I want to bless you with much success. If I could share secretly your plans.
Not such a secret.
Rabbi Romm and Shir Romm are making Aliyah, they're moving to Israel. Let's see.
But still involved in the Beit Din.
Still involved in Beit Din. And B'ezrat Hashem, first of all, you should have success. And my father, who also led the Bet Din in the former Soviet Union, he said, a successful conversion takes people from the periphery of the community and brings them to the center. Really able to transform, to be a transformational process. And even the one, if speaking, the child who was kind of more distant, having them come closer back as well. So at this point, I'll turn to ask any questions.
Oh, did you have a question?
I do.
Okay. Okay.
One is, I thought in Israel, the laws and the rules were changing about who was considered Jewish in terms of converts, right? Isn't it that now you have to have an Orthodox conversion by the Beit Din to be considered Jewish in Israel, right? But I thought some of that was changing in terms of what they would accept, so that in terms of their numbers. Can you speak to that?
Sure.
And then two, do you have any perspective in terms of the numbers? I mean, you spoke to the numbers of what Orthodox conversions you see, but do you have a sense of what the numbers are in the other denominations, like conservative or reform?
Sure. So I'm going to answer the first question first, and then because I'm getting old, you'll probably have to remind me of the second question, but I'll do my best. There are actually 2 bodies in Israel for whom Jewishness is important, and they have different rules. And for anyone who's thinking of making Aliyah or getting married in Israel or the like, this is just an important piece of information to know. There's the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, which is concerned about one's Judaism for religious purposes. So in other words, if you want to get married in the state of Israel and you're Jewish, you have to go through the rabbinate. If you want to get buried in the state of Israel, you have to go through the rabbinate. Any life cycle event goes through the rabbinate. The Israeli chief rabbinate recognizes only Orthodox conversion, and even within Orthodox conversion, only recognizes certain Orthodox conversion. So in other words, that was what we did with our network, that we're all recognized by the Israeli chief rabbinate. In general, the chief rabbinates in various countries are recognized by the Israeli chief rabbinate. So in other words, somebody who converts under the Beth Din of London, would be accepted by the Israeli chief rabbinate, the Beth Din of the Conference of European Rabbis, all these various official rabbinates around the world are generally recognized by the Israeli chief rabbinate. So that's one level of recognition. As you probably know, there's a law in Israel called the law of return, the Chok HaShvut, which allows any Jew to come to Israel and become a citizen. My wife and I are taking advantage of that, in our upcoming Aliyah. So, for the purposes of the...
Did they check your Jewishness?
Yes,
Okay.
we had to... It was
Got
actually...
a letter that you're Jewish?
It was a little bizarre because in my role as a rabbi, I've written dozens of letters for people over the years establishing that they're Jewish, but you're not allowed to write a letter for yourself. So I had to find a different rabbi to write a letter for us that we're actually Jewish. Fortunately, we're Jewish, so that worked out well. The law of return is under the Jewish agency, and Jewishness, for the purposes of the law of return, is more widely recognized. So, for instance, if you have a Jewish father and not a Jewish mother, that makes you eligible for the law of return. If you had a non-Orthodox conversion, that makes you eligible for the law of return. So in other words, the criteria are different depending on what body you're dealing with. The only thing that's changing a little bit is there might be a greater degree of recognition for other Orthodox bodies within the rabbinate.
Israel.
Within Israel, within the Israeli chief rabbinate. So for instance, there are Orthodox conversion courts in Israel that are not affiliated with the rabbinate. On a halachic level, their level of proficiency is very high, but they're not actually part of the Israeli chief rabbinate. So increasingly, some of those conversions are being recognized by the Israeli chief rabbinate. But I don't know how much that would really impact on people here in the United States. To your second question. Right, I actually do remember, which is really shocking. But okay, I guess it's a good day. In terms of Reform and conservative conversions, I don't think there's any central body in the United States which keeps track of them. One of the advantages of the system that we set up is we actually know how many people we convert. Most of conversion outside of our system, including in the non-Orthodox world, is done privately. So in other words, there isn't some kind of central body or central database where you can even say, well, there are 500 Reform conversions being done every year in the United States. I don't think anyone has that information, as far as I know. So, there's really no way to track all of that.
Any other questions?
Oh, wow. Bunch.
So
Okay.
Could we ask all the questions?
Do you allow them to live together when they're converting, or you tell them they're not allowed to?
No, so at a certain point during the process, if they are living together.
How long do you tell them they're not allowed to live together?
So it's not always a fixed amount. Typically, the standard amount would be we want to see you living apart for at least 3 months. Typically, yeah. Typically for at least.
And
Yeah.
another thing, what if you have a Kohen that
Yeah.
started to go to the
Right. So we would not.
You're not allowed to do that.
Right. So we would not convert somebody whose intent was to marry a Kohen after the conversion. Right.
So,
Am I doing the calling on people or? Yeah. Okay.
I don't remember the logistics. I
Yeah.
remember there was a situation that happened a couple of years ago with the convert from Goldsdhmidt, where he was from
Rabbi Goldsdhmidt.
Rabbi Goldsdhmidt, right.
KJ.
Right.
He was,
Right.
One of their converts was rejected in Israel, and I remember there was some
Right.
controversy from that.
Right.
Is he part of your...
Right. So that's that particular convert was not converted under our auspices. I think in the end of the day, if I recall the story correctly, she was accepted by the Israeli chief rabbinate. There was a lot of unfortunately, a lot of back and forth until they got to that point. But I think the end of the story was that she was accepted, and the story kind of ended at that point, kind of happily ever after. Although there were a lot of bumps, till they got to that particular point. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to share something personal that I haven't
Okay.
shared.
Okay.
So conversion in my family is a very, played a serious role. My great-great-grandfather was the chief rabbi of Copenhagen, Denmark, at the beginning of the 20th century, until like 1910. And there was tremendous amount of pressure. It was an assimilating community, and a lot of people were marrying out, and there was the threshold of converting before he came was bare minimum. And when he came, they expected him to do all the conversions, basically a rubber stamp, and he refused to do it. It got so tense at some point, they said, you know what, we understand you don't want to do it, we'll respect it, we'll hire an assistant rabbi who's going to do those conversions, and you're going to be exempt from doing it. And he said, no, I'm sorry, I'm the chief rabbi of Denmark. It's in my contract, and you're not going to do conversions without my permission. There was a whole question they asked many of the senior rabbis of that time, the son of Rabbi Khan, inspector of Kavna, through Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer wrote Shuvas about those who already converted, how to. One Shabbat, my great-grandfather comes to synagogue, and the rabbi's chair, was placed outside of the synagogue. His message was, listen to this. He stood that whole service, didn't sit, and he was a brilliant man. He got his rabbinic ordination in Berlin, and he had a PhD in the songs of Ibn Ezra, I think from the University of Heidelberg. He was a great orator. He spoke many languages. He was the rabbi of The Hague before that, and he sued the community.
Wow.
A second, the community lost, and they went to the Supreme Court of Denmark. My great-grandfather's attorney later became the Minister of Justice of Denmark. It came to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of Denmark had to rule. It was a few years, and my great-grandfather opened an additional synagogue where he prayed while he was kicked out. He was fired from his community, which today is the Chabad in Copenhagen, if you still go. My great-grandfather's chair is still displayed in the synagogue in Copenhagen. So you could go to both, the original community and the community left. He won in the Supreme Court a large amount. I don't know where the money is today. It's a good question. But he left, and the day shortly after he won the Supreme Court case, he became the rabbi of Zurich. And our family survived the Holocaust because we're in Switzerland.
Wow.
His name was Rabbi Tuvia Levenstein. One of his sons was served in the first Knesset of the State of Israel and was a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. His name was Tuvia Tobias. I also got fired, and I had a son born. I named him Tuvia, also named after my great-grandfather, who ended up having a long career in the rabbinate. But for him, it was a matter of, he felt that if we're not going to be careful with the standards of conversion, it could be, question is, it's the fine line between the slippery slope of assimilation to bringing people up is very delicate. So that's my personal family story, which lives very deep in our family, but I just wanted to share with you. So.
Amazing, wow.
And yes, let's get all the questions together, and I'll remind you the questions just in case you forget.
Okay.
So yes, just say your name and.
Hi, my name is Zach. I have two questions. First is, have you dealt with any conversions with the Anusim? And the second
Marranos.
question is, obviously the conversos, so like descendants of the Inquisition or
Right.
Latin American countries,
Right.
etc. Second question is, what's your opinion on the Syrian edict?
Excellent.
Okay.
Great question. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, hi, I'm Julia. Thank you so much for this talk. It's really honored.
Sure.
So I was wondering if they did adjust his expectations based on where a convert is in their life. Like you mentioned, the 8-year-old woman, she had certain capacities. She had certain, expectations, stressors, or maybe hopefully lack thereof, as an older woman versus somebody who's younger and still starting out in their career, starting out and forming their identity as a Jew and just as a person, and anywhere in between.
Okay, great.
Any other questions? Melissa.
Do you allow for a certain amount of doubt in a conversion? And the only
Doubt on whose part?
doubt on the person converting.
What specific doubt?
The easiest one I can think of is with God.
There's somebody who's converting who's agnostic to some extent.
Exactly.
Right, yeah, okay.
I keep Shabbat, I keep kosher, I don't know if God exists.
Right,
You got it.
right, okay.
Kind of a bottom-up approach.
Yeah,
rather than
yeah.
top-down.
Right.
Yes. What's your name?
Bruce Jacob.
Bruce.
You addressed briefly, in answer to the rabbi's question, the issue of converting of an infant,
Yeah,
an adopted.
right.
Can you address, it's more cutting edge, I think, the conversion, if necessary, of an infant born to fully biologically Jewish parents through a surrogacy?
Sure.
Excellent question.
Yeah.
This is great. Any other questions? Yes.
This is kind of unrelated and we did pass, but one of the worship from last week, I noticed that the word Gary was used about the Israelites by God, and
Right.
I'd never seen that before. I'm still early in my studies, so I don't know, but I was curious about the use of that, because I'd always seen that for non-Jews. Is that kind of a reminder, you think, from God, that we could all be a stranger, or do you find any meaning in the use of that?
Okay.
Okay, so let's just repeat. What do you think about Marranos from Latin America, from Spain, from the Inquisition? What do you think about the Syrian edict not to accept converts? Question, do you allow doubt for people who are not sure where they're holding faith but they want to convert to Judaism? Is there an accommodation depending on where people are in life to accommodate their specific needs? What do we say about when both parents are biologically Jewish but the surrogate mother is not? Specifically, does Judaism depend by the egg or by the by the person carrying the child? And when does the word Gerim, conversion, applies to Jews as well? What is the meaning of that?
One last one. What if the mother is Jewish, but you have embryo donation, and the embryo is
Right. That's vice versa. Excellent. We got all the questions? Excellent.
Okay. So the answer to all of them is 42. But let's try to elucidate that a little bit. I may not go in order, but I will try to get all of the questions. I cannot tell you the number of times we have had people from Latin America come to us and tell us that they are sure that they have Jewish ancestry, because after all, we have a tradition in the family that we don't mix milk and meat. My parents had separate beds in their bedrooms. My mother would always light candles on Friday afternoon in the closet. I mean, these are all things that we have heard many, many times. In general, what we've found, not just in general, I can't think of a specific instance where this has not been the case, that although it is very likely historically that they are indeed descended from Anusim, it is incredibly hard, really impossible to prove that at this stage in the game they're actually Jewish. So in other words, we have them go through a conversion. It's very significant that they are re-embracing what is clearly their heritage, and very often for them that's a big motivation to re-embrace their heritage. But in terms of, is there anything really to hang your hat on, so to speak, in terms of, are they actually Jewish based on the fact that somebody 4 generations back remembers lighting candles on Friday in the closet? It's hard to say that, but I can tell you, not once, not twice, probably 20, 30 times. I've heard people from Latin America, talk about their heritage, and it's a source of pride, and very often that's what leads them to bring it back. I'm not Syrian. We don't feel bound as a Bet Din by the edict. At the same time, I don't presume to tell another community what's good or bad for that community. The Syrian community feels that the edict was very important in terms of stemming intermarriage in their communities. If that works for them, I'm not Syrian.
How would you respond?
I'm sorry?
Is that against the halakha of loving the care?
Right. So I definitely appreciate that. And again, I would, if somebody was coming to me, as they often do, and say, I'm looking for a synagogue to connect to where I can potentially really be a part of the community, I will advise people that a Syrian shul is probably not the way to go, in terms of that. And that's come up.
What would you tell if someone would say, listen, look at the numbers, at intermarriage in the Syrian community. Have they succeeded more in preventing it? Yes or no?
I think in terms of the numbers, it's very likely that they have. I don't know if it's only because of the takana. I think the Sephardic communities in general, even those that did not have the takana, have done a lot better job at preventing intermarriage in the Ashkenazi communities, probably because there was just far less extreme assimilation in the Sephardic communities than the Ashkenazi communities. So this might have been a part of it, but I don't know if it's the whole picture. Again, I don't presume to dictate to a different community what they should or should not be doing, but I can tell you from our perspective, we do our utmost to integrate converts into communities, and we see that as one of the highest things that we could possibly do, the mitzvah of Ahavat Hager, and I see that as being a tremendous, tremendous mitzvah that we can engage in. Okay, let's try to remember over here. Doubt. I think there are different levels of doubt. I guess to some extent, no one can ever say anything with certainty, about life. I think if a person were to come and say, I'm accepting the belief in God as a kind of Pascal's wager, in other words, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure enough that this makes sense, I think something like that we'd be comfortable with. If the person were to come and say, I really don't know at all. I really just don't feel that certitude. I'm just drawn to these practices of Shabbat and Kashrut. I think we would encourage the person to reflect upon that, because in the end of the day, a cultural commitment to mitzvot, which isn't anchored in some kind of theological commitment, at a certain point doesn't, the well runs dry at a certain point. I think that ideological commitment, at least on some level, even on the level of Pascal's wager or the like, I'm pretty sure, I'm sure enough to wager on it. I think that's, just important in our own religious lives, as opposed to walking through with eternal doubt. The question of children born through surrogacy or egg donation or embryo donation. So the truth is, when I've talked about this in other contexts, that's a major, major discussion. We almost never have cases of adoption anymore. Used to be that was the standard scenario where a child would be converted. The child was born non-Jewish, was being adopted by Jewish parents, and was being converted as part of adoption. With the advances in medical technology, those parents who 30 years ago were adopting today are having a child through egg donation or surrogacy. There's a big debate among contemporary halachic decisors as to how do you determine maternity in halacha. Is it based on the genetic material, or is it based on the one carrying the baby? And just to connect this question to the previous question, the answer of the halachic decisors is, we don't know. Doubt, right? So basically, we advise that in either case, what's called a gerut l'chumra, a conversion to be on the safe side, should be performed on the child. And almost all of the children who are being converted under our auspices, who are not part of a family that are converting, but in other words, the parents are both unquestionably Jewish, but they're converting their child, it's either a case of surrogacy or a case of egg donation or a case of both. And we probably have about 10 of those cases every year from all parts of the community. So that it's a very big issue, and people should be aware of it. It's better to be aware of it when your kid is 6 months old, as opposed to the case which we had a few years back, where a woman who was in her mid-20s got a message on Facebook, "Hi, I'm your brother." "What do you mean, you're my brother? I have no idea who you are." "Oh, your parents never told you that story?" True story.
That's why you shouldn't be on Facebook.
Right. I think that's the moral of the story. Yes. So if you do have a child through that way, I think the current thinking among psychologists is that the child at a fairly young age should be told that that's how they came into the world in an age-appropriate fashion, and they should not find out when they're in their mid-20s based on a Facebook message. The Torah uses the term ger, stranger, literally a foreigner, to refer to a convert. And I think that captures the fact that, converts are very vulnerable people. They are strangers, they are foreigners, not in a way that reflects poorly upon them in any way, but simply they started off as outsiders. They came in from outside the community and are now joining the community. And the Torah uses that term in order to emphasize that we need to be especially sensitive to their needs, right? It says, do not oppress the ger, meaning convert, ki gerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were gerim in the land of Egypt. It doesn't mean that we were converts in the land of Egypt, but we were foreigners, we were strangers in the land of Egypt, so we know what it feels like to be outsiders. So we're all outsiders. So, not all of us have our chairs outside of the shul, but in a sense, every Jew is an outsider. Every Jew is a member of a minority. So we shouldn't dump on the minorities within our own community. That's really the message that the Torah is trying to put across in that particular way. There was at least one other question, I think.
About accommodating different life
accommodating
stages.
different. So it depends exactly what you mean by that. We never compromise in terms of commitment. We want to see the commitment, regardless of how old you are. We might adjust in terms of what we would expect in terms of knowledge. Also as people grow older, the things they need to commit to be a Torah observant Jew sometimes diminish. So for instance, if people are converting in their 60s, so we're usually not talking about educating your kids in yeshiva day schools. That's just usually not an agenda item, at that point in time. Some of the issues that relate to family purity at a certain point just are irrelevant, when you're dealing with older people. So, some of those things recede into the background, and some of the knowledge issues, again, like I said before, we adjust, depending on what we can reasonably expect from the person. But I think it's important to emphasize the commitment to a fully Torah-observant life is something which is unchanging, regardless of the point in life at which one happens to be. Did I actually cover all of them?
Covered everything.
Oh my gosh.
Rabbi Romm, you should be Masech to be Kaddish and Shema.
Oh, no. Thank you.
I hope it wasn't too annoying.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thank everybody. Everybody should only have blessings and success in their lives.
Like
What?
Ruth, we talk about Ruth, like converted to the mother-in-law. How many converted with their mother?
How many converted with their mother-in-law?
Not to the husband, to the mother. Like Ruth,
Right. Right.
How many like that preferred in the mother?
I'm not sure what you mean by the mother-in-law, but in terms of the depth of commitment, that's what we're looking for. That's really the criteria. Yeah.
That's a tough one.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay.
So interesting.
Yeah, okay. No, glad to have you be a part of it. Nice to see you.